Welcome to the Cheating Confession Reddit channel. Today, I'm going to share with you a real-life cheating story. It will give you a better understanding of the issue of infidelity today and help you be more cautious when it comes to a cheating wife. Let's dive into this story together.
From the window of his second-story bedroom, Mike Gallagher gazed down with a heavy heart as his wife, Christy, lingered at the front door, wrapped in a fervent embrace with Jake Williams. Jake, the man who had for years professed to be Mike's closest confidant, had just dropped Christy off after spending hours together downtown. This wasn't their first secret meeting. It was their fifth. As Mike strained to make sense of their muffled conversation, his stomach churned at their brazen betrayal. Jake proposed an extended getaway, a whole week together. Christy, after a playful pause, refused, her voice firm yet flirtatious. "Not an entire week, Jake," she said, teasingly yet decisive. "Maybe a weekend, but only if you agree to one condition." Jake's brow furrowed slightly. "What condition?" he asked, tilting his head. A mischievous sparkle danced in Christy's eyes. "Mike has to pay for it," she declared with giddy excitement. Jake chuckled softly, shaking his head in disbelief. "That's absurd," he replied. "You know I'm far better off financially than he is. Why make him pay?" Christy's lips curled into a sly grin. "You're missing the point. It's not about the money. It's about his humiliation. You love making him feel small, don't you?" Jake leaned back slightly, stretching as if to dismiss the notion. "Well," he started with a smirk, "he is my best friend." "Oh, stop with the act," Christy interrupted, rolling her eyes. "You enjoy tormenting him as much as I do. Admit it. Watching him squirm thrills you." Her voice dropped to a sultry whisper. "And it's the biggest turn-on for me." While her excitement was nearly tangible, Jake's expression soured slightly. "Christy," he said with a mix of irritation and sincerity, "why keep this up? End it. Leave Mike and come with me. I'll marry you. We'll build a life together." She laughed lightly, shaking her head. "Tell you what, sweetheart. Make him fund our weekend and I'll think about it. How's that?" Though Jake sighed with frustration, a sly grin soon spread across his face. "Fine," he murmured, leaning closer to whisper something inaudible in her ear. He kissed her again before retreating to his car. Christy waved as he drove away, a triumphant smile plastered on her face. Then, with an air of casual confidence, she turned and entered the house. As she ascended the stairs, her movements deliberate, she peeled off her clothing piece by piece, leaving them discarded along the way. By the time she entered the bedroom, she was completely bare, having foregone undergarments for her rendezvous with Jake. Inside, Mike sat motionless on the edge of the bed, his face pale and strained. Christy strolled into the bathroom without a second glance, leaving the door ajar as she inspected herself in the mirror. "I assume you overheard everything," she said flatly, meeting his reflection with a smirk. "I'm leaving you for Jake. We're spending the weekend together, and you're paying for it. After that, I'll leave you for good." Mike's voice cracked as he finally spoke, his words laden with despair. "I've done everything for you since the day we got married. I thought I made you happy. Do you even love me at all?" She turned to face him, her expression dripping with contempt. "Love you?" she scoffed. "How could I? You're nothing but a pathetic doormat who lets his best friend steal his wife." Her words sliced through him, leaving him visibly shaken. He turned away, his shoulders slumping as tears brimmed in his eyes. "Why?" he pleaded. "What about our vows? Don't they mean anything to you?" Christy laughed bitterly. "Vows? Don't make me laugh. Why should I care about promises made to someone as pitiful as you?" "Please," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Don't do this. I love you more than anything." She rolled her eyes, her tone icy. "Love me all you want. Just don't think for a second you'll ever touch me again. If I want satisfaction, I'll call Jake. Maybe I'll even let you watch. Would you like that, Mike?" As she reveled in her cruelty, Mike's demeanor began to shift. His posture straightened, his jaw tightened, and a newfound resolve hardened his features. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and low, carrying a weight that made her freeze. "Enough," he muttered as he stood. For the first time, Christy faltered, her smugness replaced by a flicker of unease. She followed him as he walked purposefully out of the bedroom and down the stairs. "Where are you going?" she demanded, her tone mocking. "Running off to cry somewhere? Maybe to your mommy's house?" Mike paused at the front door, his hand on the knob. Turning to face her, his expression was one of quiet sorrow rather than anger. "Goodbye, Christy," he said simply before stepping outside. She stood in the doorway watching as he drove away. Shaking her head, she muttered, "Good riddance," before pulling out her phone to call Jake. "Hey, babe," she purred. "He's gone. Come over, I can't wait to see you." 3 days later, Mike returned. The sound of his car pulling into the garage startled Christy, who sat at the kitchen table sipping coffee and flipping through the newspaper. She looked up as he entered, briefcase in hand. Without a word or even a glance in her direction, he walked past her and disappeared into his office. A surge of curiosity propelled Christy to her feet. Leaving her desk, she walked briskly to the door of Mike's study. When she tried the handle, it didn't budge. Locked. That was odd. Mike never locked that door. She rapped lightly on the wooden panel, and after a brief pause, the lock clicked. With a slow turn of the knob, she opened the door. Inside, Mike was at his desk, focused intently on a map displayed on his computer screen. Christy assumed it was related to the new housing development he was spearheading near a local lake. Without looking up, he asked curtly, "What do you need?" His gaze, when it finally met hers, was laden with an uncharacteristic weight. The harsh tone caught Christy off guard. Mike had never spoken to her like that before. Then again, she knew she hadn't been her best self with him recently. Trying to steady her voice, she said, I was worried about you. You've been gone for 3 days without a word." "I called you," she added, watching his expression harden. "But you didn't answer." His response was laced with derision. "Oh, you were worried about me?" he asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. Christy froze. Was this really her husband? Though he looked and sounded like Mike, something about him felt fundamentally altered. Shoving aside her unease, she reached out to touch his face, but he pulled away. The rejection stung. "What's wrong?" she asked, her frustration breaking through. "It's been 3 days. Don't you even want to kiss me?" Mike's stare was as cold as stone, his detachment palpable. After an unbearable pause, he shook his head. "No," he said bluntly before turning back to his computer. "Close the door on your way out." Christy stood frozen for a moment, then quietly shut the door and retreated to the bedroom. Her heart raced. The man she had just seen was a stranger. Her hands trembled as she grabbed her phone and dialed a familiar number. It barely rang before a man answered. "Jake," she said urgently, her voice breaking. "He's back, but something's wrong. He's different. He wouldn't even kiss me." Jake's voice was calm, almost soothing. "Relax, sweetheart," he said smoothly. "He's probably just realized you're leaving him. There's nothing he can do to stop it now. I'll come by tonight and we'll take care of everything. Just let me talk to him first." Christy hesitated, then nodded, though he couldn't see her. "Okay," she said softly. "I hope you're right. See you tonight. Take care, love." As she hung up, she didn't notice Mike sitting silently in his study, a faint smirk playing on his lips. He had overheard enough. That evening, headlights illuminated the driveway as Jake's car pulled in. Christy opened the front door before he had the chance to knock. She kissed him deeply, as if to reassure herself. "Where is he?" Jake asked once they broke apart, his voice low. She gestured toward the study. "He hasn't left that room all day." Nodding, Jake straightened his shoulders. "I'll talk to him alone," he said firmly. "This won't take long." Jake approached the study and knocked on the door. Finding it locked, he called out, "Mike, it's Jake. Can we talk?" There was a brief silence before the lock clicked. Jake stepped inside, offering a cautious smile as he extended a hand in greeting. But his smile faltered as he froze mid-motion. Mike was lounging in his chair, his gaze steady and unnervingly sharp. He made no effort to stand or speak. Jake awkwardly lowered his hand. "Close the door and sit," Mike instructed, gesturing toward the chair across from him. His voice was calm, yet it carried an edge that made Jake uneasy. Jake complied, closing the door and sitting down. Mike poured himself a drink with deliberate movements, but offered nothing to Jake. "No drink for me?" Jake tried to joke, attempting to lighten the heavy atmosphere. Mike ignored him, his expression unreadable. "Friend," Mike began slowly, the word drawn out as if it were foreign to him. "Are you truly my friend?" The question made Jake shift uncomfortably. "Of course," Jake replied, forcing a smile. "We've been best friends for years, you know that." "Best friends," Mike repeated, his lips curling into a sardonic smile. "Tell me, Jake, what kind of best friend steals another man's wife?" Jake's confidence wavered. His voice was unsteady as he stammered. "Mike, I didn't mean—" "Spare me the excuses," Mike cut him off sharply. "You've been circling like a vulture, waiting for your moment to take Christy. Don't insult me by pretending otherwise." Jake fell silent, the weight of Mike's words pressing down on him. "How much do you want her?" Mike asked, leaning forward, his voice dangerously calm. "What is she worth to you?" Jake blinked, caught off guard. "I don't know what you mean," he said, his voice faltering. Mike let out a low chuckle. "Don't play dumb, Jake. You're a businessman. Every transaction has a price. So let's talk. What's Christy worth to you?" Jake struggled for a response, his confusion evident. Mike leaned back in his chair, his smirk returning. "I'll make it simple," he said casually. "I like that new Bentley of yours. How much did it cost?" Jake hesitated before answering. "Over $500,000. It was custom made." He tried to sound confident, but his voice betrayed him. "And it's paid off?" Mike asked smoothly. "All yours?" "Yes," Jake said, his tone defensive. "It's mine." "Good," Mike said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Then here's the deal. Your Bentley, and 25% of your equity." Jake's eyes widened in shock. "Wait, you want my car? And a quarter of my assets? For Christy?" Mike's smile widened, but his eyes were as cold as steel. "That's the offer," he said, raising his glass in a mock toast. "Take it or leave it." Jake tensed, his jaw clenched, and disbelief flashed across his face. "That's over $50 billion, he said, his voice filled with a mixture of outrage and shock. "Have you completely lost your mind? Or is this some kind of sick prank?" Michael, unperturbed, glanced briefly at his monitor. $52 billion to be exact, he replied in a measured, unemotional tone. "And no, I'm not joking." Jake shot to his feet, pacing the room with jerky, restless movements, muttering under his breath. Frustration radiated off him as he cast accusatory glances at Michael, who remained composed, calmly rifling through a stack of papers. After a tense silence, Jake stopped abruptly, slumping back into his chair. He fixed Michael with a hard stare, equal parts exasperation and unease. "Let me get this straight," Jake began, his voice taut and subdued. "You're asking for my car and 25% of my equity in exchange for Christy?" A smirk tugged at the corners of Michael's lips. "That's exactly what I'm asking for," he confirmed, leaning back in his chair with an air of smug satisfaction. "Christy did warn you that manipulating me wouldn't be easy." Jake's hands balled into fists. "Why am I even entertaining this?" he muttered under his breath, shaking his head in disbelief. Without a word, Michael reached over to his printer, retrieving a freshly printed page. He slid it across the table toward Jake. "You might want to take a look at this," he said, his grin unwavering. "Think about what happens when this lands on your boardroom table, gets shared with your shareholders, or worse, ends up in the media." Jake's eyes darted across the document, his face draining of color as he read. The letter laid bare every sordid detail of his affair with Christy, exposing him in a way that left him defenseless. He slammed the paper down. "This is blackmail," he spat, glaring at Michael. "Call it whatever you like," Michael replied with a casual shrug, pouring himself a glass of scotch. "The deal's on the table until noon tomorrow. After that, the terms double. 50% equity, plus controlling interest in your company." "This is outright extortion!" Jake snapped, throwing his arms up in fury. "You'll never get away with it." Michael took a slow sip of his drink, unbothered. "Maybe I will, maybe I won't," he said with infuriating nonchalance. "But let's not pretend you don't want her badly enough to consider it. So, Jake, what's it going to be?" Jake hesitated, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. I need time to think," he finally said, his voice barely audible. Michael nodded, feigning understanding. "Sure, you've got until noon tomorrow," he said, tapping his watch for emphasis. "Time's ticking." Jake wiped his brow with a handkerchief and stumbled toward the door, his movements unsteady. Michael didn't bother looking up as he left. "Close the door behind you," he called out, signaling the conversation was over. Through his window, Michael watched Jake and Christy leave together, chuckling to himself as he reached for his phone to make a few calls. Later that evening, he heard Christy's laughter outside as she returned in Jake's car. Their voices drifted through the driveway. "Just a few more days," Jake said, "and we'll be free of him, a fresh start." Christy laughed softly, pushing Jake's hand away as he reached for her. "Not now, Jake. Soon," she promised with a sly smile. "I can't wait to see him groveling as a waiter." She kissed him briefly before heading inside, leaving Jake to drive away. Inside the house, Christy noticed the light on in Michael's study. She tried the door but found it locked. "Michael?" she called out, pressing her ear to the wood. "I want to leave." From the other side, Michael's calm voice responded, but his words were distant. After a moment, Christy gave up and went upstairs, unease swirling in her thoughts. The next morning, Michael received a curt text from Jake. "Deal." Smiling to himself, Michael sent over the details of an offshore account. A few hours later, the funds were confirmed. He dispersed the money across several private accounts and sent a simple message to Jake and Christy. "Dinner is at 7. Don't be late." Michael spent the afternoon preparing for the evening. Cooking had always been a therapeutic escape for him, and this meal carried a sense of finality. By 6 o'clock, the aroma of the food filled the house. Christy returned home, visibly surprised. "You're cooking?" she asked, eyeing him warily. "I didn't know you could." Michael didn't look up as he wiped his hands on a towel. "There's a lot you don't know about me," he said evenly. "If you'd spent more time here instead of with Jake, maybe you'd have learned something." His words stung, and Christy flinched. She reached out, but he turned away, his expression cold. "Go get ready," he said curtly. "Your lover will be here soon." Tears welled up in her eyes as she retreated upstairs, her steps heavy with regret. Staring at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, she whispered, "What have I done?" At precisely 7 p.m., Jake arrived. Michael opened the door, his demeanor cool and distant. Jake handed over a folder containing signed documents along with a set of car keys. "I guess it's business first," Jake said, forcing a laugh. Michael pocketed the keys without a word. "As promised," he said, his tone clipped. "Help yourself to a drink." Shortly after, Christy descended the stairs, dressed in a sleek black dress that hugged her figure. The absence of her wedding ring was glaring. Michael pulled out a chair for her at the table, his expression impossible to read. She eased herself into the chair with poise, her smile soft yet unwavering. Across from her, Jake collapsed into his seat, his grin stretching as far as his confidence. "You look absolutely radiant," he said, lifting her hand to his lips in an exaggerated display of affection. "And I see those rings are gone now. Progress at last." Her lips curved slightly as Michael approached the table, balancing a silver tray with 2 bubbling glasses of champagne. He placed them down with precision, vanishing briefly into the kitchen before returning with a steaming dish in hand. When he lifted the lid, the warm aroma of lasagna wrapped around them like a blanket. "Smells incredible, Mike," Jake said, shaking out his napkin with a self-satisfied air. "Maybe you've missed your true calling all these years." Michael didn't respond, his face unreadable as he served generous portions onto their plates. Christy hesitated, her fork poised in midair, as she cast a glance in his direction. "Aren't you joining us?" she asked, her voice gentle but uncertain. Michael shook his head and quietly began pouring champagne into their glasses. "No," he replied, his tone distant. "Tonight is for the 2 of you. I wouldn't dream of interfering in your celebration." He stepped back, watching as they raised their glasses in a toast, their shared laughter filling the room. Soon they were so engrossed in each other that neither noticed when Michael slipped out of sight, a peculiar smirk playing on his lips. In the privacy of his study, Michael settled into his chair and checked the time. "Not much longer," he muttered, the words barely audible. True to his prediction, the silence was shattered moments later by two muffled thuds and the faint clatter of something hitting the floor. Rising with deliberate calm, he strode back to the dining room. There, Jake and Christy sat slumped in their chairs, unconscious. Jake's head rested awkwardly against his plate, his arm hanging limp. Christy had collapsed to the side, her dress riding up enough to reveal the lace trim of her stockings. Her head hung forward, and shards of broken glass were scattered around her limp arm. Michael took in the scene with a cold, measured satisfaction. "Perfect," he murmured, "out like lights." He moved with practiced efficiency, changing into more utilitarian clothes before setting to work. He stripped the unconscious pair of their clothes, arranging their bodies into a twisted, intimate tableau. Using rough rope, he bound their limbs tightly together, ensuring they were inseparably entwined. From the garage, he fetched a wheeled cart, maneuvering their tangled forms onto it, before securing them with heavy chains to keep them immobilized. Once gagged and restrained, their bodies were stuffed into a large sailcloth bag, carefully selected for this very purpose. A dolly and hoist allowed him to transfer the bag into the trunk of his Bentley, locking it with precision. Under a sky freckled with stars, Michael started the engine and left the quiet streets behind. Hours later, he reached an isolated location, pulling off the road into a shadowed clearing. As he opened the trunk, faint rustling and muffled sounds emanated from the bag. He unfastened the top just enough to reveal their bewildered faces, their wide eyes brimming with fear as they tried to make sense of the suffocating darkness. Michael leaned in, holding a stun gun aloft for emphasis. "If you stay quiet, I'll remove the gags and explain," he said evenly. "But if either of you screams, I promise it won't end well for you." He punctuated his point with a sharp crackle from the device, prompting frantic nods from both captives. After removing their gags, Christy was the first to speak, her voice shaky and desperate. Where are we? What's going on? Who are you?" Jake chimed in, his tone just as panicked. "Why are you doing this? What do you want from us?" Michael's gaze hardened as he stared at them. "You're standing at the very spot where your husband decided his life wasn't worth living anymore," he said coldly, fixing his eyes on Christy. "This is where Mike took his final breath." Christy's mouth fell open, her face draining of all color. "No, that's not true. That can't be true." "Oh, it is," Michael said sharply, his words cutting like a knife. "Do you know why he did it? Because of you. He told me everything, about your cruelty, your betrayal, your indifference. You left him with nothing, Christy. Nothing." He turned his icy glare toward Jake. "And you, his so-called best friend. You stabbed him in the back, stole his wife, and laughed in his face while you did it. Some friend." Tears streamed down Christy's face as she shook her head. "No, Mike never said anything. I didn't know. I didn't know he had a brother." Michael let out a bitter laugh devoid of humor. "Of course you didn't. He kept me hidden, trying to shield you from the darkness I bring. But here I am, cleaning up the wreckage you left behind. And now," he gestured toward the glimmering water behind them, "you'll get what you deserve. Welcome to Bottomless Lake, the place where Mike ended his suffering, and where your reckoning begins." The lake shimmered ominously under the moonlight as Michael dragged them toward its edge. The weight of his vendetta hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting, as the night bore witness to his grim justice. You took twisted delight in tormenting him, playing with his feelings, building up his pride only to crush it, and exploiting every chance to belittle him. "But you swore to me that Christy and I would have forever." Jake's voice cracked with raw despair as he glared at his captor, his head lifting defiantly despite his anguish. "You betrayed me. You lied to me." Jake's shout fractured into a desperate cry, his fury barely masking his fear. Michael's only response was a cold, humorless laugh. "Technically, I didn't lie. Michael replied, a smug grin curling his lips. I promised you and Christy would share the rest of your lives. That promise still stands. What I left out, Michael continued, his voice as steady as a blade, was just how short those lives would be. You'll share your time, yes, intensely, dramatically, even romantically, depending on how you look at it. But you'll die on the same day. A tragic ending. Poetic, wouldn't you say? Especially considering the little plot you two cooked up against my brother. It's justice, balanced and poetic. Please, I'm begging you, don't do this to us, Christy sobbed, her tears streaking her face as she struggled to make him listen. But her pleas only seemed to harden Michael's expression, his cold eyes narrowing as he looked at her with utter contempt. Interesting, he said flatly, his tone cutting like ice. Mike told me he begged you with those exact words. He pleaded for mercy. And how did you respond? You mocked him. You carried on your sordid affair in plain sight and laughed when he confronted you. You shattered him, broke him completely. And when he asked you to stop, what did you tell him? To accept his fate. Michael's voice dropped into a venomous snarl. Now it's your turn to accept yours. Christy screamed in fury, her voice filled with both rage and terror as she thrashed against the chains that confined her. You're insane! Let us go! Someone will come for you! You won't get away with this! Michael shrugged, his expression indifferent. Perhaps, or perhaps not. By the time anyone starts asking questions, they'll find a beautifully written farewell letter on your computer. It's quite touching if I say so myself. He tilted his head slightly, as though considering a minor detail. But let's not dwell on that. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to an almost conversational tone, as though sharing a macabre secret. You've heard about this lake, haven't you? They call it bottomless for a reason. No one's ever found its depths, and I can assure you no one will ever find you either. That chain binding you together will ensure you sink straight into the abyss. He gave the chain a sharp jerk, the metallic clinks echoing ominously. Jake and Christy were paralyzed with terror, their faces pale as the weight of their fate pressed down on them. Their trembling was almost imperceptible, their voices stolen by fear. Michael watched them for a moment, a thin smile curling his lips. You've got maybe a minute of consciousness once you hit the water, he said, his mock sincerity dripping with malice. A couple of extra minutes of life after that if you're lucky. Look at it this way, you're getting more time than most. So say your goodbyes. He sighed theatrically, his tone dripping with false pity. What a pity there won't be any vows this time. No rings, no music, no priest to bless your union. But hey, enjoy your last honeymoon. With that, Michael grabbed hold of the bag, tipping it with all his strength. The two tumbled out, limbs flailing as they fought against the unyielding grip of the chain binding them. Their screams tore through the night, rising in a crescendo of desperation before the lake swallowed them whole. The splash reverberated in the stillness, and Michael watched as the heavy chain pulled them down, their struggles fading beneath the dark surface. Bon voyage, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the last faint bubbles rising to the surface. The lake returned to its eerie calm, moonlight dancing across the rippling water. Michael turned back to the boat, starting the engine with a low rumble that shattered the silence. The faint glow of the marina lights pierced the pre-dawn fog as he navigated back to the dock. He tied off the boat with practiced ease, cut the engine, and strode toward the sleek Bentley waiting in the shadows. Sliding into the driver's seat, he started the car, relishing the quiet hum of the engine. As he pulled out his phone, he made a mental note to deal with the bag later. Burn it, just to be certain. He typed a quick message. It's done. The reply came immediately. Thanks, bro. Enjoy the ride. My friend, and this is the end of the story. If you liked this story, then put your royal like and subscribe to the channel. May the force be with you.